When Saudi Arabia breaks its silence, the world listens. Not because the kingdom has always been the loudest voice in the room. It rarely is. Saudi diplomacy has historically preferred the back channel to the public declaration, the private communication to the formal statement, the specific conversation between principals whose contents are understood by the people who matter without being broadcast to audiences whose reactions complicate the management of the situation being addressed. Saudi silence in moments of regional crisis is not the silence of a disengaged actor. It is the silence of an actor whose communications are happening in the channels that produce outcomes rather than the channels that produce headlines. When Saudi Arabia breaks that silence, when the kingdom's leadership decides that the moment requires public communication rather than private management, that the specific message it needs to send cannot be delivered through the back channels that normally suffice, that the situation has reached a point where the weight of Saudi Arabia's public position is itself a strategic instrument whose deployment the moment demands, the world listens. Because Saudi Arabia's decision to speak publicly tells you something about the situation that the content of what it says only partially captures. It tells you that the situation has crossed a threshold where private management is no longer adequate, that the stakes have reached a level where Saudi Arabia's public positioning is itself part of the response, that what MBS has determined in the specific conversations his intelligence and his diplomatic network are generating about the Gulf escalation has produced a conclusion whose communication requires the full weight of the kingdom's public voice. Saudi Arabia just broke its silence on the Gulf escalation following the Iranian attack on the U.S. Navy warship in the Strait of Hormuz, and what it said, the specific content of the statement, the specific framing, the specific action it is urging, is more significant than either the fact of speaking or the diplomatic language in which the content is wrapped. It is the content of an actor who has been preparing for exactly this moment, who has positioned itself precisely for the influence it is now attempting to exercise, and who understands that what it says in the next hours and days will shape the trajectory of a crisis, whose escalation it can manage, or whose uncontrolled development it may not survive. Let's understand precisely what Saudi Arabia said, because precision about the content is the foundation of understanding its significance. The statement that emerged from the Saudi Foreign Ministry, and from the specific communication channels through which MBS's direct voice reaches international audiences when he chooses to deploy it, contains several distinct elements whose combination tells a more complete story than any individual element alone. The first element is the condemnation. Saudi Arabia has condemned the Iranian missile attack on the U.S. Navy warship. This condemnation is significant in ways that go beyond its rhetorical content. Saudi Arabia and Iran signed the Chinese brokered normalization agreement in 2023. They have been maintaining the specific functional working relationship that normalization enabled. Not a warm relationship, not a trusting relationship, not a relationship that has resolved the fundamental strategic competition between the region's two most consequential powers, but a working relationship whose maintenance has been a feature of the Gulf strategic environment for the past several years, and whose disruption carries costs that Saudi Arabia has been managing carefully. Condemning Iran's attack on a U.S. warship is not an act of neutrality within that normalization framework. It is a specific positioning, a public choice of side in the immediate confrontation between Iran and the United States that the attack has created. Saudi Arabia's decision to make this choice publicly, at the speed at which the statement was issued following the attack, tells you that MBS had already made this decision before the attack occurred, that the specific Iranian escalatory trajectory documented in previous analyses had produced a Saudi assessment that the normalization framework was no longer the primary organizing principle of Saudi-Iran policy, and that the Gulf escalation that the attack represents has crossed the threshold where Saudi Arabia's interests require public identification with the American position rather than the careful equidistance that normalization management demands. The second element is the call for immediate action. Saudi Arabia is not simply condemning what happened and calling for calm and restraint in the diplomatic language that international statements routinely deploy when the actual preference is for the situation to de-escalate without requiring anyone to take positions that complicate their subsequent management. Saudi Arabia is urging immediate action, a specific, directional, operationally meaningful communication that the situation requires responses rather than deliberation. What immediate action? The statement's specific language identifies several dimensions of the action Saudi Arabia is urging. It is urging the international community, specifically the United Nations Security Council, the Arab League, and the specific multilateral forums through which Gulf security architecture is managed, to convene immediately and to produce the specific resolutions and the specific mandates that the attack demands. It is urging the United States to respond in ways that restore deterrence, language that is diplomatically coded but operationally clear in its communication that Saudi Arabia is not urging restraint in the American response to the attack. And it is urging the specific actors in the Iranian system, the IRGC commanders, the political establishment, the elements of the Iranian institutional architecture that Saudi Arabia's intelligence network has relationships with, to understand that the attack has crossed a threshold whose crossing has activated responses that Iran's own interests require it to consider carefully before the escalation progresses to stages whose management becomes impossible. The third element is the specific offer. Saudi Arabia is offering, publicly and with the authority of MBS's direct engagement, to serve as the specific diplomatic facilitator that the current crisis requires, not as a neutral mediator whose equidistance between the parties gives it legitimacy with both sides simultaneously, as the specific actor whose relationships with both the American-led coalition and with the Iranian institutional architecture whose behavior the crisis requires to change give it the specific access and the specific credibility that effective facilitation demands. The offer is remarkable in its specificity. Saudi Arabia is not offering to host talks or to provide good offices in the generic form that middle power diplomacy typically involves. It is offering to deliver specific communications to specific actors within the Iranian system, to use its specific intelligence and diplomatic relationships with elements of the Iranian institutional architecture to transmit the specific messages about consequences and about options that the American-Iranian confrontation requires to be transmitted through channels that neither party can use directly. This offer reflects the specific positioning that MBS has constructed through the strategic maneuvering documented throughout this analysis series. The Pakistani military framework, the Chinese financial relationships, the oil strategy, the Iranian normalization management, the Gulf security architecture, all of these have been building Saudi Arabia's specific portfolio of relationships and influences that now constitute the facilitation capacity that the crisis demands. MBS has spent years building the position he is now offering to use. The crisis has created the moment where the value of that position is most visible. Now let's examine why Saudi Arabia's specific positioning in the Gulf escalation matters beyond the immediate diplomatic contribution that the statement represents. Saudi Arabia's strategic interests in the Gulf escalation are not identical to the United States' strategic interests, to Israel's strategic interests, or to any other actor's strategic interests. They are Saudi Arabia's interests, shaped by Saudi Arabia's specific geographic position, its specific economic vulnerabilities, its specific institutional relationships, and its specific strategic ambitions, whose realization the current crisis either advances or threatens. The most immediate Saudi strategic interest is Hormuz. Saudi Arabia's oil exports, the revenue foundation of Vision 2030 and of the Saudi state's entire economic and political architecture, transit the Strait of Hormuz. An Iranian attack on a U.S. Navy warship in the Strait is an attack on the specific waterway, whose functionality Saudi Arabia's economic survival depends on. Saudi Arabia's condemnation of the attack and its urging of immediate action to restore Hormuz security is not simply geopolitical positioning. It is the defense of the specific infrastructure through which its own economic lifeline flows. The escalation dynamic that the attack has initiated, the specific risk of a broader American-Iranian conflict whose conduct in and around the Hormuz Gulf area could disrupt oil transit for periods measured in weeks or months rather than days, is the specific economic catastrophe that the Gold for Oil financial architecture, the Vision 2030 diversification program, and the broader strategic repositioning that MBS has been executing were designed to reduce Saudi vulnerability to. Those preparations reduce vulnerability. They do not eliminate it. A sustained Hormuz closure and a full American-Iranian war would impose economic costs on Saudi Arabia that even the most careful preparation cannot fully insulate against. Saudi Arabia's urging of immediate action to end the Gulf escalation is therefore simultaneously strategic communication, diplomatic initiative, and economic self-defense, the specific combination that the intersection of its interests and its capabilities in the current moment produces. The second Saudi strategic interest is the Iranian succession dynamic. The previous analyses have documented the Iranian supreme leader's health crisis, the succession competition, and the specific instability of the Iranian political system in its current configuration. The Iranian attack on the U.S. Navy warship, whatever its specific authorization and whatever its specific political context, is an event whose occurrence in the specific moment of Iranian internal crisis tells Saudi Arabia something about the state of Iranian institutional decision-making that its intelligence network is urgently assessing. An Iranian attack on a U.S. warship that was authorized by the supreme leader as a deliberate strategic choice in full awareness of its consequences is a different intelligence assessment from an Iranian attack that was authorized at a lower level of the command structure, or that reflects the specific IRGC hardline radicalization documented in the previous analysis, or that represents the specific behavior of an institution whose succession crisis has disrupted the normal decision-making processes that prevented previous Iranian provocations from crossing into actual state-on-state military attacks on U.S. vessels. Saudi Arabia's intelligence assessment of which of these scenarios more accurately describes what happened is directly relevant to its facilitation offer. Because the effectiveness of Saudi Arabia's communication to elements of the Iranian institutional architecture depends on whether those elements have the authority and the capacity to receive and act on the specific messages that Saudi facilitation would deliver. A fragmented Iranian decision-making structure that cannot receive and implement messages from external facilitators is a different diplomatic challenge from an Iranian structure that is coherent enough to make the calculations that facilitation is designed to enable. The third Saudi strategic interest is the American relationship, specifically the specific moment that the Gulf escalation creates in the American-Saudi relationship, whose evolution has been a central theme of this analysis series. Saudi Arabia has been systematically building its strategic independence from American preferences through the oil strategy, the Chinese relationship deepening, the Pakistani military framework, and the non-dollar pricing development. That independence project has been creating friction in the American-Saudi relationship in ways that MBS has calculated are acceptable given the strategic value of the independence being asserted. The Gulf escalation creates a specific moment in which Saudi Arabia's independence from American preferences and its alignment with American strategic interests are simultaneously present. A moment where being independent of American direction and being aligned with American strategic objectives are not in tension. Saudi Arabia condemning the Iranian attack and urging immediate action that restores Hormuz's security is Saudi Arabia acting in alignment with American strategic objectives without being directed by American preferences, demonstrating the specific form of strategic agency that MBS has been building precisely to occupy this kind of moment. The specific opportunity this creates for rebuilding elements of the American-Saudi relationship that the oil strategy and the Chinese relationship deepening had strained, for demonstrating to Washington that Saudi Arabia's strategic independence does not translate into strategic opposition, but into strategic agency that serves broadly compatible objectives through Saudi-determined means, is an opportunity that MBS is consciously exploiting through the public statement and the facilitation offer that the Gulf escalation has created. The international response to Saudi Arabia's statement is being processed through the specific frameworks of every actor, with stakes in the Gulf escalation's trajectory. The United States is receiving the Saudi statement and the facilitation offer through this specific combination of appreciation for Saudi public positioning and careful assessment of what the facilitation offer actually involves and what accepting it implies for American management of the crisis. The specific American calculation about whether to use Saudi Arabia's facilitation capacity, whether to allow Riyadh to serve as the channel through which specific messages reach elements of the Iranian system that direct American communication cannot access, is a calculation about both effectiveness and precedent. Effective, because Saudi Arabia genuinely has access that American channels lack. Precedent setting, because accepting Saudi facilitation in a crisis of this magnitude implies a level of American-Saudi security cooperation that the relationship's current state of managed tension does not officially acknowledge. Israel's response to Saudi Arabia's statement is the specific combination of appreciation for Saudi condemnation of Iran and careful assessment of what Saudi Arabia's facilitation offer implies for the Israeli strategic interest in a comprehensive American military response to the Iranian attack that addresses the nuclear program, as well as the naval attack. Israel has the most acute interest of any actor in ensuring that the American response to the attack is not limited to the specific naval dimension that the attack's immediate form presents, that the crisis is used to address the Iranian nuclear threat that Israeli strategic doctrine treats as existential, rather than being managed back to a de-escalated status quo whose restoration leaves the nuclear threat intact. Saudi Arabia's facilitation offer, and its implicit framing of the crisis as manageable through communication rather than exclusively through military response, is not entirely aligned with the Israeli strategic preference for comprehensive military action. The specific Israeli diplomatic activity in Washington, in the immediate aftermath of the Saudi statement, is aimed at ensuring that Saudi Arabia's facilitation offer does not become the frame through which American decision-making limits its response to the naval attack alone. China's response to Saudi Arabia's statement is being processed through the specific lens of Chinese interests, whose complexity has been documented throughout this analysis series. China has relationships with both the U.S. and Iran. It has the most significant single stake in Hormuz security of any external actor, and it has the specific relationship with Saudi Arabia that the previous analyses have documented as deepening through the oil strategy and the financial architecture development. China and Saudi Arabia are not coordinating their Gulf escalation responses explicitly. Their interests are sufficiently convergent on the immediate questions of Hormuz security and crisis de-escalation to produce parallel messaging without requiring the kind of explicit coordination that would complicate both parties' management of their respective relationships with the United States. But the convergence is real and is producing a combined weight of international pressure toward de-escalation that the American decision-making process is incorporating into its assessment of the range of responses available. Russia's response to Saudi Arabia's statement is colored by the specific combination of interests that the previous analyses have documented: the strategic value of American distraction from the Ukrainian theater, the economic cost of Hormuz disruption for already pressured Russian energy export revenues, and the specific Russian-Iranian relationship that the three ships documented in the previous analysis represent. Russia is not condemning the Iranian attack, but Russia is also not publicly endorsing it. The specific Russian position is the deliberate ambiguity of an actor that benefits from the crisis's existence while not wanting to bear the diplomatic cost of being identified as the attack's enabler. Saudi Arabia has spoken. The silence that Saudi diplomacy maintained while assessing the attack's full implications has been broken at the specific moment that MBS determined the moment required the kingdom's public voice. The content of what was said, the condemnation, the call for immediate action, the facilitation offer, is the product of the specific strategic positioning that this analysis series has documented MBS constructing. Across years of patient, risk-tolerant, unconventional strategic management of Saudi Arabia's position in the emerging global order. The moment he has been positioning for has arrived. A Gulf escalation of genuine regional and global consequence. An Iranian actor whose behavior has crossed thresholds that Saudi Arabia's interests require it to publicly address. An American decision-making process whose outcomes Saudi Arabia's facilitation capacity can influence. An international community whose response to the crisis Saudi Arabia's voice can shape. Saudi Arabia broke its silence. The world is listening. And what comes next in the Gulf escalation that the Iranian attack initiated will be shaped in part by the specific weight of what Riyadh has said and what MBS has offered. That offer is on the table. The clock is running. And the Gulf crisis, whose trajectory the next hours will determine, is the moment that everything documented in this analysis series has been building toward.